Good morning, everyone. It is 9 a.m. and I would love to call this meeting to order of the Community Economic Development Committee for Thursday, July 6th. My name is George Martinez. I'm the co-chair. We'll begin with the introductions from the members, beginning with my co-chair.
Kevin Cross, Anchorage Assembly.
Scott Myers, Anchorage Assembly.
Zach Johnson, Assembly.
Brian Yell, Planning Department.
Craig Lyon, Planning Director. And Chris Schutte, Private Consultant.
Karen Braga, Assembly.
Francis McLaughlin, Planning.
Thank you. We're also joined by staff
Jenny Brister, the clerk's office.
and additional folks in the room with interpretation and signs. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have a short meeting, agenda setting meeting primarily. We don't have any unfinished business on the agenda at this point. And so the main topic for our discussion today is on the new business is item number A. We received the list of the annual workflow that came from the recommendations from the assembly. So during the last X amount of meetings, folks referred things to our committee. We have been requested to order this for our work schedule for the remaining year as best as we can, and there's some. My intention today is that we walk through this list with approximately 45 minutes in total to get an update on where some things may be, and or just a quick understanding of the priority matrix, whether they're short, medium, or long term. I don't want to go through merits today about any of the action items. We just want to walk away with an understanding of how we should incorporate these into our workflow. And then the second item is B. Similarly, we'll have a discussion on that, but I expect that to be a short discussion, high level, setting out a trajectory of workflow. Great. So on that note, I would love for us to go through each one of these items one by one and just get a quick update, 3 minutes or less. Anybody has things to say about them. If we don't have anything in terms of an update, then there would be the question of how we want to prioritize them. Are they short, medium, or long-term goals? Mr. Cross, does that work?
Yeah, and then if we can consolidate, if there's any that we
Yes.
see here that we consolidate into one project in order to make this more palatable.
Excellent, wonderful. And I just encourage everybody also to speak up loudly. We may have folks on the phone, so if there are any members on the phone, please identify yourself now. Excellent. We don't seem to have any members on the phone. So, alcohol law changes. I wasn't on the body when that was mentioned, so I would love to know if anybody has a recollection of what that means, and are we already beginning to do that with the work of Annabelle?
Yeah, we just did that the last assembly meeting. We approved the updates to, Dean, was it? It's not, was it Title 8? I'm trying to remember which one that was. There's so many titles right now floating in my head. Title 10, thank you.
Title 2 and 10.
Title 2 and 10, so we just passed that update. There'll be another omnibus coming up. The one we did got us more in compliance with the state, and now I understand that Brawley and some other individuals, along with our alcohol and marijuana board, are working on the next set of updates and criteria to bring us further in compliance or more Anchorage specific. The last update we did was more state specific to bring us in line with what was happening in the state. So, and that's proceeding. But does anybody have anything else specific that they're working on regarding alcohol law changes, or Dean, do you know of anything that you might be brewing in the background?
I think you described it well, Mr. Cross. The recent one was more to update our code, which was sort of a patchwork of years of different ordinances. I mean, chapter 230 for our procedures, assembly, 1080 for our local regulation. It was more cleanup, but it also needed some compatibility with the recent state law changes. But now, I guess, they're starting the drafting process with staff for right now for the changes that we're substantive in compliance with the recent state law SB 9, which goes into effect January 1, 2024. And so that's our target date, is to complete our work before January 1 for those substantive changes to be more compliance with SB 9.
So my guess is, looking at timelines, we probably won't see something before this to chew on until October, so that we can have it done by mid-January.
Great. And
I kind of think the staff were trying to get it to you guys for September. And for the budget cycle, when it gets underway, October, November.
thank you, Dean. We'll flag that as there are some things happening in motion. We've already begun work. And there seems to be a short-term window of additional work to come. And so I think we are tracking that, and we'll walk away with, my intention is that the chairs walk away with kind of an understanding of when we will put it on our calendars, according to the kind of short and midterm. So we'll track that as well. Get an update, B, get an update from Road Map to a Vital and Safe Anchorage Group. So we're supposed to get an update from them. Any updates on whether we have received an update? What does it take to get an update? Who are they? Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris Schutte, private consultant. I can speak to mostly who they are and what's happening now, but not about whether they've been contacted for an update. So the roadmap to a vital and safe Anchorage, which is a weird acronym, I will admit, it is the evolution of a business and economic support committee group that we stood up during COVID. And it was focused primarily on how can we balance the restrictions that were in place around COVID with the need to conduct business and things like that. As the pandemic and its impacts began to subside, there was a lot of interest from the participants in that effort in continuing some sort of business-focused, economy-focused group that could continue the work that was started under the had a different name back then, but continue the work started under COVID and help push the conversation about how the Anchorage economy needs to evolve and adapt, not just in response to the pandemic, but in response to the way the world's changing today. We granted the money to AEPC initially. They hired SALT, a consultancy here in town, led by Michael Fredericks. They have monthly recurring meetings on a variety of topics. They regularly provide updates on their various tasks, et cetera. Very exciting group. The last meeting was, actually there was one last Tuesday I didn't attend, so I can't tell you what was on the agenda, but the previous meeting was a walking tour of downtown to look at what are the successes we've seen in developing downtown, what are the barriers we're seeing, what are the current conditions, et cetera. There's a great chance to tour, for example, the building that Sheldon Fisher and Mark Begich bought, see what they're doing. So it's an interesting group, and I would be happy to connect you with Michael Fredericks for that update if you'd like.
That would be phenomenal. Thank you, Christopher, for that update. And I would just also put it out there. I'm also interested in the update on the original call to action work as a future-facing preventative piece of information. If we were still in the pandemic, for example, we still had those types of conditions and we still needed that research, that would be good to know in the future what they learned from that experience and what they gathered as well. Any other thoughts on that? Good. That's a B, so we'll get an update on that. We'll get connected. I think I will follow up on that, and I will bring that back to the group as necessary. C, expand tax abatement and reinvestment focus areas, RFAs, citywide. Anyone can speak to that update?
Well, I think it'd be important for us to kind of set up a work session here in the next coming months, perhaps even before we do the October budget, about taking another look at some of our tax incentives that we've stuck out there. Our downtown development tax incentive that we had originally was a full tax abatement for 12 years, and then it came back that the state said you got at least taxed for the ASC budget. So then basically it was a 50% reduction after they had already broke ground and started development. It was already figured into the loan criteria of meeting their debt service coverage ratio about how much they could lend. And then they come back and say, oh, wait a second, it's not a full tax abatement. It's just a partial tax abatement after they've already done their financial draws. And so We've heard, I've heard quite a few complaints from downtown developers that was a pretty glaring error on the part of the municipality to promise one thing and then deliver another. And so I think that's definitely a conversation that we have, whether we extend that from a 12-year to a 24-year, since they're paying 50% net investment being the same, or how do we work with that in order to make sure we come through on our end on what we promised. Other things we can look at is expanding that. Did it function, did it work, and what other kind of long-term development is in the best interest of Anchorage, and where can we work together. And that would be really important if we're going to do anything like that, to talk to the ACBA, who works with a lot of developers and kind of has incentivization programs. Is that the proper way to use that word? But because I know that they communicate fluidly, and the ACDA does these little programs and stuff. We can see from their communications on where do they feel is the right buttons to push to move things in the right direction. But I think that's probably should be a group of individuals that look at all our tax, everything we're doing, property tax or tax-wise, and see what needs to be corrected.
Yes, Member Brawley.
Yeah, this is Anna. On that point too, I think it's important to remember there's a Senate Bill 77, they're calling it the Blight Bill, but part of it is giving cities, as I understand it, more authority to deal with blighted property, but also to have more authority to give tax incentives. And so I think it's a really good idea to look at the ones that we already have. But I would also say that if and when that bill passes, and I'm hoping it's next session by May, then we should also look at how to implement that into our city law, because it's not an automatic thing. And I think it would give us more tools than we have now. So I guess my suggestion would be look at what we have, figure that out, and then maybe pause on making any expansions until we look at what are, if there are expanded tools to do that.
Wonderful, yes, thank you, Member Brawley. Just for the record, we've been joined by Member Brawley. Dean Gates.
Thank you. I would just add to the topic of tax abatement. I do have a project to update, I guess, and renew deteriorated property tax abatement ordinance from 2014. It's for Fairview area deteriorated property tax abatement under our Title 1235 for a code. And it gave that, I guess, well, to set the table a little bit, there's a two-step process for deteriorated property. First, these invest in Clarity area that's deteriorated, blighted, and get tax abatements, 2 applications. And it's up to property owners to apply and explain how we should get that tax abatement. But this is just the first step that we did in 2014. As I understand it, there was only 1 application, but I guess I have a project to renew that for another 10 years, so property owners in this blighted area can continue to develop their property, get tax, I guess, relief for the improvements that they add to a property, to their property. So hopefully we'll see that coming, because it expires next year. I was asked to do the project thinking it expired this year, but it expires when we're in.
Mr. Gates, thank you. What's your timeline on that work, on that project?
Well, I would get it done for the fall, through September, but it's not really going to be time sensitive until next year, July.
Okay. Mr. Cross?
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that. I think that's a good idea, and I think it should be expanded beyond Fairview, because there's lots of pockets of blighted properties. The average age of real estate in Anchorage is about 45 years. We had that huge surge, in the 70s, early 80s, but we haven't really been keeping up with new construction. So, you'd be surprised when you drive around, and I'm sure, our code abatement can speak to that there are little pockets of blighted areas where property is in dire need of repairs. And so if we can incentivize that beyond just the Fairview area, I think that would be very valuable.
So I'm hearing that this is, I'd love the idea of a work session or a group. I would encourage us to think about who needs to be at the table to talk about it with respect to what's happening now, kind of a state of affairs, a longer term outlook and expectation about the alignment with potential state changes. And so I'm hearing that as a short term action item, and I'll leave it to Mr. Cross to really help us get a time when you think it really works.
I didn't know if Craig, I was curious if Craig knew of anything they were working on their side regarding this or anything, because I know that there's been some other conversation about blighted properties.
The only thing we're working on right now is the RFA ordinance that came before you last month or so. And that's going, was requested to have that go to the Fairview Community Council so they can get a weigh in on it. So that'll happening in August, and then it'll come back to you. But that's the only thing we're working on right now in regards to this.
Thank you, Craig. No, I'm hearing, yes, Mr. Gates.
I just wanted to comment that there's a variety of tools to help redevelop some blighted properties. There are RFAs are one, and the tax abatements or deteriorated properties is another. I'm not sure which tools are most effective ones for developers or property owners.
Yes.
So that would be something that gives
Yes.
a good question to investigate.
Yes.
Which are the most effective tools.
And I promise that we will have a whole conversation about blighted properties, distressed properties, vacant and abandoned properties, all the different ways to say it. I just wanted to establish that we're having conversations with the bucket of the tax, the different ways that we look at this. We'll have a powwow, and I hope that everybody brings all of these different elements of what they're working on and the timeline to the table. But I think that after that timeline that Mr. Craig laid out, the end of August into September, that's probably a perfect timeline for us to do that. Great. D, look into Navigator program for building permits. Any updates on what that is? All right. What was the intention? Do we know what the hope of that action item was?
And maybe Ross can speak to this. Wasn't the Navigator program, the online program for building permits, and what's the name of that program that was recently, or they've been working on for the last 2 years and just got rolled out and they're still ironing things out?
Well, we are updating our permit tracking software we're building basically a more expansive front end to allow people to apply for permits online. We already have a completely paperless process where you can apply for permits and get permits and never come into the building. But the public in general is not aware of it. It's our regular users, like the Anchorage Home Builders Association, commercial contractors and whatnot are much more aware of it. So where we're at on this project is the software is mostly complete, but it's at this stage it's really very buggy and it needs a lot of work and refinement before we can release it to the public.
And do we have an ETA on that, or do we have?
Oh goodness, I mean, part of the problem is we're in the heat of construction season, and so we're short-staffed at the permit counter. We're short-staffed across the board, so it's getting put on the back burner while we're meeting the needs of our customers. So most likely, this isn't going to get hashed out until this fall, and with the goal of having this thing completely online, in December, January-ish, probably timeframe.
Okay.
Thank you. And just to note, that's a different workflow.
I do not know if that is what the Navigator program is.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
Navigator is lowercase n, so I'm guessing that Navigator is not the name of the program, it's just navigating building permits. So I'm assuming that's part of it, just looking at the way. It may have been or sentence structure, but lowercase n does not indicate the name of a specific program.
I hope we were grammatically correct in our agenda. I'm going to take that because just looking at the way reinvestment focus areas was capitalized, and I'm going to assume that's correct. And I saw some nods of agreement in the audience as well. So thank you for that. That gives us a timeline for that particular action item. If there are other things that fit into improving navigation for customer service or processes, we would love to hear about it and have those things updated as well. For anybody who's working in the particular areas around building permits and other things. And if there are additional challenges, we also constantly want to hear about those as well so we can help. Excellent. I know the answer to this is moving forward on E, but is there work to do at the state level to sync the 2-year marijuana licenses? So I hear about the marijuana license syncing, and I think we've had a little bit of introduction to that. What's the state of affairs on the syncing of the 2-year marijuana licenses? And I think Member Brawley was
Yeah, I'm not
working on
leading
this.
this, but I could answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I know Member Constant's really interested in
Okay.
that topic. And then, as I understand it, the city, so there's local and state licensing for marijuana, it's different than alcohol. And with the marijuana licenses, the city has already changed to a 2-year renewal cycle, which is the same as alcohol. But for the state, all the licenses are in regulation. I don't believe they're in statute. And so it would take a regulation change. So I don't know, that would be a question to AMCO and the Marijuana Control Board. I don't know their intent to do that or I'm not updated on that, but I know that's, Chris's intent is to look at our licensing system and then to advocate for the state changes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cross, did you have anything additional to add to that?
I didn't.
Okay, so Mr. Gates.
Thank you. I agree with Mrs. Brawley, except I think that there is a statute change needed. That the state statute says their licenses are in. I did not when Ms. Ati was part of it, we were working on the ordinance. So they don't parse legislation.
So either way, it takes state action, but.
State action, and presumably that would be an action item through our legislative committee as well, potentially on an agenda for that.
Yeah.
Right on. So that's in motion, in fact, now. There's work being done on that now. Member Constant is leading on that now, and I expect that there will be some advocacy work around the syncing of those two bodies. Anybody have any additional comments on that? Excellent. Well, sticking with the same family, F is hemp regulations. And this says, we're waiting for a state update, potential to treat packaging and sales issues similar to spice regulations from 10 years ago. Can anyone speak to that item?
Sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I can speak to that item through the chair. So the Assembly passed a resolution. Oh, sorry, Jennifer Benaclausen, Legislative Services. Last year, the Assembly passed a resolution calling for the state legislation to further regulate the hemp industry and particularly protect Alaska youth. So we were waiting for the regulations to come out from the state. Those were issued about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, through the Department of Natural Resources. So I sent that link to Mr. Cross, Mr. Rivera, and Chair Constant, and we're looking at writing a letter to respond. It's kind of a public comment period to respond to the regulations. And Matthew Hurt with Assembly Counsel's Office is comparing the regulations to the resolution that the Assembly passed last year to see if it does any of what you were hoping it would do. And I think we'll be able to take a further look after that.
Yeah.
yes.
So this is a response to the Delta 8 and Delta 9 synthetic variants that are coming through. That is the loophole in marijuana distribution that fall under the Department of Agriculture. And so they're, one, not paying taxes, and two, they're not abiding by the distribution rules, the licensing rules. They're showing up in areas where they can be sold to minors. And because the Department of Agriculture measures in Delta 8 and Delta 9 as a synthetic form of hemp under a different intoxication classification, it's based on weight rather than potency, they're able to find that loophole and sell a controlled substance basically around our regulations. So this is to close those loopholes and make sure that and the great news about this is that the largest advocates in helping us is the current marijuana industry, because they see that these individuals exercising these loopholes are detrimental to their own businesses because it gives them a black eye. And so that's where we're proceeding with that. Again, this is a response to some bad players out there utilizing our own laws to subvert the intended regulatory process. Thank you.
Thank you, Co-Chair Cross. I heard about this, and it's exciting to hear that there's in motion work that had already been laid out, and that we'll have a review of those updates and a possible report back from the action that those three members will take within a very short time period, it seems like. So, any additional items?
Just that there will probably be some room, once we know what the state is doing, then there will probably be some room to do something within our own code.
Excellent. So there may be some additional cleanups on our code as well. That's wonderful. Thank you for the work, Mr. Cross, and thank you for the update, Jennifer. Excellent. G, all right. Looking into Heritage Land Bank and real estate land disposals for potential housing development. Well, what is that action item? Or what do we mean by that? And what is the update, if we have any today?
We don't have anybody from HLB here currently, but I know that, and it may have been even issued recently, and I just need to get caught up on my pile of paperwork here. Which was, there was a resolution that went out probably 6 months ago from the Assembly requesting that HLB provide us a land analysis on what was available. Their primary, they released the one from Girdwood, but it was supposed to expand into the rest of Anchorage also. So they came out with their, not a comprehensive plan, but just available land, what is wetland, how much of that acreage is immediately ready for disposal or could be built for housing, what would be the intended use according to the long-range plans. And additionally, the next part of the analysis was to look for off-site improvement requirements, because although land may not be available, it may not be financially viable depending on the regulations for development on a parcel. They had identified a couple parcels, for instance, that required over, a mile and a half of additional, public road to be built around an acreage, which was, another $1 million, $1.2 million onto the cost of the neighborhood before they could build anything just for infrastructure. So one was identifying the land that's available, and then not only what's available basically based on an environmental standard, wetlands, soils, buildability, but then regulatory overlays on top. And then that would be good for us to have a discussion with HLB on where they're at, and maybe they can give us an update specifically of what their studies have revealed.
No, I agree, and thank you for that, Mr. Cross. I would love to request a presentation from them with that update and the additional land analysis.
I think it'd be really good for all our new members too, who haven't had a chance to really dig into all the work HLB has been doing and kind of their role in helping housing.
Wonderful. Mr. Gates first?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. I would just add that HOB has an annual work plan and a 5-year program that they are updating annually. They don't always do that. Historically, we used it for years, and as I understand it, they didn't do it this year. It usually comes out in this spring. So that would be a good opportunity, I think, to ask them to give you an update on this year's annual work plan.
Wonderful, thank you. Mr. Schutte?
Thank you. Dean stole my thunder. I was just going to point out that there's the annual work plan. Part of that does outline the proposed disposals, if any, from HLB. So I do recommend people maybe prime whoever will be presenting from HLB prior to that work plan session to let them know that this is a topic of interest. So maybe they could address it during the work plan. And then secondly, in the past, there have been individual parcel transfers between MOA ownership and, for example, ACDA. And we did a number of those between 2017 and 2020 time period. There was one piece, I'm a little biased towards this, that we really wanted to get out of MOA ownership and into ACDA's hands. I don't know if Jim wants to speak to this, but everyone may not know this, the Nordstrom building sits on 5 different parcels of land, and we, the city, own one of them. And so there was always an interest in having ACDA be more active in sustaining that building and or pursuing redevelopment options. And an easy way to put them in the driver's seat was to give them ownership of that parcel. So I know that transfer didn't occur. I just would mention that as maybe one option that Jim seems to be sort of nodding at as maybe a good idea.
Yeah, Jim Weingartner with ACDA. That is a good idea. I can't speak to anything else in that area. There's some ongoing action.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Christopher. Member Brawley?
Yeah, just adding on the work plan, I know that is something that HLB is supposed to be doing, and I know we don't have the staff right now to do it, but I just want to emphasize too, I think we should make sure that any disposals that are happening or planned are compatible with that, and certainly that work plan can be changed, but I guess I know there's been discussion about basically liquidating HLB or, like these kind of more drastic things, and just to say that there is a plan and a process that they follow, and so we shouldn't, so in our enthusiasm to find land to dispose, which I think is a good idea, we shouldn't circumvent that process, we should emphasize that that process needs to be followed, so just to add on to that.
Thank you, Member Brawley. Member Cross?
Just the last thing is, I think it would be real important for HLB, before they decide on what land they're gonna dispose, since it's in their best interest to sell it at fair market value, that since we're in the process of doing some pretty significant code modifications, that will have direct effect on the value of those parcels, depending on their size, location. I mean, we're talking about making adjustments to triplex, fourplex, and that's coming up, or adjustments to R4A, or whatever that looks like. I think it'd be interesting to know one layer of aspect is how will these changes affect the value of that land positively or negatively, and get HLB's input on that. It would be good that once we've, to get them at the table at some point, and we can probably inquire and prepare, whether it's Emma or whoever it is from HLB upstairs, we can ask them when they might be ready to give us a presentation. And oh, by the way, how do you see some of these changes that we're enacting affecting various land values around acreage? I think that'd be an important aspect. That way they're not selling at a significant discount, or, I think in light of these code changes, I think developers and stuff would be more interested or more inclined to bid on it and drive the cost up, so we're not selling parcels prematurely at a discount.
Just wanted to point out a happy coincidence that the HLB plan is already on the books for August 4th for an assembly work session.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer, for just recognizing that the HLB plan is on the workbooks for assembly work session on August 4th. That's good news, and I think the idea of a presentation is a wonderful idea as it coordinates with that work session. H, everybody. We're moving right along. Expedite permitting during peak season. Now this sounds kind of like a suite of things that expedite permitting, make it easier. If I was going to capitalize the word navigation and make it a program, I would want expedited peak season permitting to probably be a part of making the processes easier and more accessible to the public. What did we mean by expediting permitted during peak season, and what is the status of that? Who can speak to that? Mr. Cross?
Just real quick, I think that and D go together.
Yeah.
So the conversation about expediting permitting was the utilization of the funding, or the online permitting process, which as Ross has pointed out, there's bugs, but I think a big part of expediting the permitting during peak season falls back on our lack of employees or vacancies within that department. We had somebody in the permit, was it Gretchen? Was that her name? I'm trying to remember who we lost, who was there for years. Who was just she worked so well with the contractors, and she was such a resource. So when you lose those key individuals, they retire after being there 15, 20 years. You find one person who does the work of three, and then you're hiring. So I mean, maybe Ross can speak to some of that as far as expediting permitting during peak season, about the struggles that they have and how we as Assembly can support them.
So probably the biggest struggle we have with the permit counter is we get people in, we get them trained. It's actually a very complex job. It takes probably a year because they have to know this huge amount of information. We get them up to speed. Other positions open up in the muni and they move up, and we lose them. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard to retain people at the permit counter level. This isn't anything new. This has been that way forever. Assemblyman Cross is correct. We did just lose an employee that was very productive, and so now we're kind of down to like 3 people at the permit counter during the busiest time of the year. We have open positions on the street, and anybody who's in the business of trying to hire anybody right now knows this is a very challenging hiring environment. So that's what we're struggling with there.
if I could ask a follow-up question just to the process to give my understanding. What is the degree of discretion that an individual who serves in that role at that counter has? Because I'm just thinking of you know, what are the ways you overcome personnel or systems?
Yeah.
And so what's the degree of discretion, and to what aspect are there other remedies to help beyond personnel?
Well, there's not a whole lot of discretion that they can exercise until they really know what they're doing, because when you come up with ideas to take shortcuts, all your actions have consequences. They can either affect the inspectors, or they can affect the plan reviewers, and people may not realize that take the actions of their shortcuts, right? So people have to be reined in. They have to be trained and reined in, and they can't really go cowboy, and I hope I'm addressing your question, until they really know what they're doing. Because there's consequences to skipping steps.
Yes, no, I understand. So, no, it's a complex human resource issue. No question about that. And I don't know if there's any action items that we can take aside from being vigilant and being attentive to any requests for support that may come from the department, and helping to get the word out as best as we can about vacancies, but that's true across the entire municipality with respect to the workforce. So,
I mean, it's correct in the sense that one of our holdups is HR, but HR is having problem staffing, right?
That's right.
It just, it doesn't end.
Mr. Cross?
Well, one of the, yeah, that's, you know, like a snake eating its own tail, right? So, one of the things that you have is understanding, okay, we need people who really understand the permitting process in order to consolidate or streamline the permitting process. So, I mean, if we're going to improve the systems, you need to have people who really know the systems. And so, on what it seems like happened is we built this really complex permitting system. It even takes someone over a year to even get trained on how it works. Think about that. Think about what that means about the process and how complicated it is and that we've created. And just for someone to get a basic understanding, it takes over a year of training and just issuing permits. So then when we don't have those individuals to carry on that legacy to then educate individuals, and then we're looking to consolidate it, like how do you run more efficient when you're just trying to get caught up on training people how it works? You know, you've got to understand how your old Chevy pickup truck works fundamentally at a basic level before you can start making modifications and improvements. So, I mean, it's like, so we've got to get caught up to get people who understand it, because we as an assembly, we don't have, with everything we do, how do we even make suggestions on how to radically improve it or streamline it when it takes somebody who's doing it as a full-time job over a year to comprehend it? So I think that's going to be a real challenge that we're facing for some time. I think some of those immediate tools are going to be getting the online portal, getting more people away from the desk and using online tools and paying online to free up some of the man hours of people sitting at a countertop helping someone fill out a form. Because those are important positions, but they're time consuming and it's repetitive tasks that could be pushed off. So I see some of this as far as getting their free time at the administrative level is going to be using our technology tools. And however, as an assembly, we can support the building department on getting those IT back. I don't know if that looks like helping, and you know, I know that I don't know what IT departments within the municipality are limited on working certain projects, but it sounds to me like the one that's at the permitting desk is close. It's just got some bugs. So who can help us if they're short-staffed to do that themselves? That's going to free other people. So maybe that's something we can look into.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it sounds like just the timing that you mentioned earlier with respect to the online portal, spring-ish, I'm being a little more generous than I think you said December and January, but thinking of Q1, essentially, next year, 2024, it would be interesting to see how we can come alongside in the public awareness of that so that we can help try to push more folks to the utilization of that portal for the summer and for the summer season. Thank you, everyone. On that item, we're going to go to letter I. Expand the roles of community land trusts, also in housing and homelessness. who would like to speak to that item? I know that I've recently had a conversation, and we had a big old housing summit, and I believe that there were some presentations from folks who are working in these areas, and I'm thinking of Jason Bockenstedt as one of the people who we've done work with from the city's perspective, and there's new units of workforce housing and low-income housing that are coming online from some of the projects that they represent, that we have invested in as a municipality. But can anyone speak to just what this is? I would love to bring this into other parts of our conversation. I see how this connects to other buckets, but are there any high-level updates or informationals that we need to have today so we can situate how to roll this conversation into our workflow? Mr. Schutte.
Thank you. Not so much an update, but just food for thought for the committee. In addition to Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust, there is obviously the Anchorage Community Land Trust, which has a long history in Anchorage, focused primarily in Mountain View and now it's in Art Fairview. It'd be useful to talk to them about the genesis of founding that organization, how they've approached their role as a land trust over the years. Would be instructive. And then I would point out that Girdwood is in the middle of, or already has established, Zach might know, its own land trust, looking to create and replicate some of the programs and successes that ACLT has seen in Girdwood specifically. And so that would be represented by Crystal Hoke, who I think is called the executive director or some title like that for the Girdwood Trust. And they have done substantial research into how land trusts work across the country, and they're trying to model their work after that. So those are some other entities that would be good to help set the stage for what's the current status of the land trust and what they do, and what are the barriers or opportunities for the city to support their work.
Mr. Schutte, just a follow-up question. You may know the answer, someone else may have it. When was the follow-up for the housing summit supposed to happen? I think there was supposed to be one in the fall.
Yeah.
It seems like there may be a good nexus point to having some tracks that are coming out of our discussions to really be situated, highlighted, and extra focused, like land trusts and community land trusts during that housing summit, so that we have very specific tracks. It seems like we can pull some recommendations from these lists as well. Thank you. Yeah, Member Brown?
Yeah, I'll also add, there's some discussion about manufactured housing, specific to, well, a couple different mobile home parks, but also generally, this could be some avenue for like a resident-owned community or some other alternative land ownership structure. And so no one's pursuing that with any particular park at this point, but that was something that's been identified as a way to keep folks more secure, especially if they don't own the land, if they do own the unit, or even if they don't own the unit. So I think that's something just to flag that it'll be related as well.
Wonderful. And I'll note that I recently bumped into Kirk from the Land Trust, ACLT, who we were going to set up a time to connect as well. And I'll try to get them to also start to visit our meeting. I think it's important to have more folks who represent these various interests of our interconnectivity at the table regularly. And so I want to extend the invitation to our meetings to them as well. See if they have anything to present prior to the fall summit. But I think that's a great timeline to let everybody know we have these expectations of these tracks for the organizers of the summit. Great. All right, Jay. Ooh, this is a good one. Create catalog of pre-approved plans.
This was a discussion that came out of the last housing summit. These are the things that have occurred in other areas around the United States. Basically, we're at Hubble Telescope, which is, we've seen this, it's been brought to our attention. This works in other areas for expediting and lowering the cost of development. But we're still in the early stages. What needs to happen is a more comprehensive study with other cities around the United States that have put this into play, what works, what doesn't work. More importantly is to understand that that typically the architectural drawings of a builder are proprietary to the architect, and so they have rights to those. And so what does that process look like to building a database where those architects would be willing to release their hard work for the benefit of the public? And so we're still at like I said, a Hubble telescope view. We haven't got into the metrics of it. I think what that'll probably end up looking is that we're looking at a small group of assembly members, 2 or 3 who want to do that research, put something together, and then provide a presentation. So I think right now what we would do is if that's something that we want to pursue, and that's something me and Meg, and I'm trying to remember who else have discussed, but it's been probably about 2 or 3 months since we brought this up again. What I could probably do is take my assembly aide and have that individual reach out and come up with some information from other municipalities or other cities around the United States as we dig into that deeper. But we're still really at a high level on that one.
Excellent. So thank you, Member Cross. So I have Member Cross is going to take the lead on that, and I think the lead is really about the starting point for the catalog in the first place by doing some preliminary research and investigation. And I might also suggest in the research and investigation IP, intellectual property, opportunities for the question about how you work with proprietary information, and the way there could be creative opportunity for income generation for a creator of such IP, intellectual property, and the way cities have dealt with that. That may be a good area to investigate as well. And I just wanted to note, I've been tracking what members are kind of connected to each item as we go through, but if there's really explicitness to an action item that a member said, hey, I would want to take that particular area of work on, or I'm doing something in that area, just make sure we know it as well. Member Brun?
So I wonder if focusing just on accessible dwelling units, if you started in phases, that there are pre-approved plans for something smaller like that. I know Seattle and different communities in Washington have a catalog of accessible dwelling unit plans. So it might be a good way to roll out something smaller first.
Member Cross?
No,
That's a great idea.
Yeah, we could look at that. Obviously, the challenge you have is when you're taking plans from another area, they should probably go back and make sure they're applicable to Anchorage building plans, just simply because we have a different seismic zone, we have different requirements. That's the struggle that you have is when you take ideas from other areas, you move them up here, then you realize that there's differences. I mean, even our shadow study, is based on the equinox from the lower 48, but doesn't take into consideration different sun angles. So even our shadow studies are flawed because we have different sun angles at different times. But so whenever we bring that stuff up, but yeah, it would be easy to start smaller or just start with, talk to our builders, and I think that'd be good to get the Anchorage home builders on and say, hey, listen, how would we get you to partner with us? Because we don't want to get in business of drafting plans and doing all that stuff. Like, how can we? Right. Are you willing to contribute to a shared database that you're willing to allow the public? Because we don't want to create another layer of bureaucracy that then we have to end up funding. If this is a benefit to the builders and home build and to contractors and individuals, then how can we just support or provide links to an already existing database? That's kind of where I see that going, because I don't want it to be something else that we have to constantly maintain or create a whole other department to run.
Great. Yes, Ross?
So the building department already has a pre-approved plan program, and it's had it for decades, which basically means that once the MOA reviews a certain plan, it no longer goes through plan review, and there's a reduced permit fee for it. But it works pretty good because the building department does re-review. We don't create designs or anything. There's a whole myriad of issues that crop up when you start producing work versus just reviewing work. The pre-approved program doesn't get used anymore. And the reason is because the vast majority of builders hire their own plan reviewer to do the plan review, right, for their permits. And so if they're building a similar house plan multiple times, I would assume that they probably have negotiated a deal with their reviewers where they get probably a reuse fee versus an original review fee when they're. So this is all currently occurring in the private sector, what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
Just a little bit of education note.
Thank you. Great. Sounds like there's work there. I'd love the idea, in fact, of kind of how you start with a category and add on to what we potentially have and learn from what the private sector is doing to facilitate and get out of the way as best as we can. Speaking of which, K, third-party review for commercial. Mr. Cross, can you open us for that?
Yeah, this is an AO I brought at the beginning of last year, after it went to SEAC, which is a Structural Engineers Association of Alaska, and it went back and forth. Basically, there were so many changes that, it basically had hybrided a considerable distance from where it originally started. And after now that we have 5 new members on the assembly, it would have been a lot to kind of catch up and see what goes. You know how complicated it gets when you have multiple S versions, S1 that goes through. So what we did is we postponed that one indefinitely, and Dean is currently, and I are currently working on a whole nother brand new ordinance that cleans everything up with all the suggestions that came out of SEAC and everything. So, we got a third party, independent plan review for commercial construction. Just like in residential and duplex, where you have the right to use a third party for your plan review prior to coming in and getting permits. Our thought was to expand it to commercial construction, but with some very specific carve-outs. It would have some, give the authority of the plan reviewers, the municipality, to audit 10% of them. It eliminates, the new one eliminates significant structures, which are buildings that I think house, it's either 300 or 500 people, forgive me, I think it's 500. Schools, power plants, things like that. So there's a whole different category that would be completely exempt from third-party independent plan review. Additionally, had additional insurance requirements. And so there's a lot of protections in there that people are concerned, because when you think commercial construction, obviously, you could be talking about a rather large project. So how do we expedite that process? Because here we just saw we've got twice in there, it talks about expedited permitting during peak review season. Those issues, we've actually heard that they're shorthanded. But how do we expedite those? Because the cost of commercial construction goes up. It's gone up significantly, at least as far as the holding time for commercial construction. That's been my personal experience. But how do we expedite those so that we continue to get development, but at the same time not sacrifice the safety, right? We still want to make sure the end product is equal to or greater than we're currently getting. And so that's currently back to be drafted. Once we have that new updated version that incorporated all the suggestions out of SEAC, it'll probably come back before this committee, and then we'll do another work session. We'll invite everybody and say, hey, listen, does this sound reasonable? You gotta understand this will only be used periodically. I don't think it'll be a tool, because we've got some pretty good structural reviewers here at the Muni, but I think it'll give the ability on some really large projects that get bottlenecked, the ability to utilize some highly qualified individuals in the private field, in private structural review, in order to expedite some of these. But we'll see what happens on the other side. This came out of, this was supported by not just the Anchorage Home Builders, but the Alaska Association of General Contractors, separate labor unions. You got to remember that whenever we delay a project, whether it's months or a year, that has a detrimental effect, not just on the developer, but on plumbers, electricians, foundation guys, employers. I mean, we're denying a lot of people work and opportunity to work when we unintentionally create delays in projects. So it's just another tool on how do we expedite these timelines. It's surprisingly more controversial than I would have thought. So we'll see what happens on the other side of this and where it falls. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Do you have an expected timeline for the next piece of
it's
work
not.
to come to us?
It's not it went from on a scale of 1 to 10, I usually categorize things on a scale of 1 to 10. It went from a 7 or 8 down, because I really wanted to get it before we had this construction season, but we're kind of already into it. So I think even if it passed now or it passed the next 6 months, it's not really going to benefit until the next building season.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I got to be sensitive to poor Dean over here, because Dean's carrying the workload of like 18 people, and he's short-staffed. So I'm like, okay, let's prioritize these. I'm not going to lean on Dean to get this until he gets a snorkel and some water wings.
Yes.
But
I would categorize it as mid to long versus a year of service as our committee. So,
I'm guessing that's a year out.
yeah, right on. But, I can see that work can start on that in the spring, early next year. It's probably good to start to generate some stuff. Mr. Shute?
Thank you. Just a process question for Mr. Cross. I lost track of the original ordinance. Is it still active in front of the body?
No, we postponed it indefinitely with the
Thank you.
intention of, because it had a lot of amendments. And so, I came out with we originally, when I first was having this idea and I had to go through Dean, who's found out that there had been some previous work done on this long ago, somebody kind of thought about this, so then we had to go through this whole process of examining what I had come up with versus what was in there, and we met with Adam Trombley, and we had different things, say, okay, well, and I had met with some of the individuals that had worked on the first one, and so, when we came out with the first one, I realized this was still, again, a little higher view, and then it had to go through the process, meet with SEAG, meet with the building department, and then what we discovered is that, there was a lot of really legitimate concerns. And so how do we implement those in? And probably after about the third wave of, hey, let's make these other adjustments, it really ended up getting kind of convoluted, because whenever you're dealing with something that's 14 plus pages, and everything, and every page has scratch outs and stuff like that, it gets hard to wrap your head around. So what we decided is, hey, let's just start over since I got a whole new assembly. Or not a whole new, but close to a majority.
Thank you for that update. And just one note of political literacy, and for anybody that's tuning in, sometimes a sausage is too messy, in fact, to have it go through, and you want to start over with a fresh sausage. Thank you, Mr. Cross, for that. And you're also on the next item here, housing presentation, then versus now with Title 21. Mr. Cross?
Yeah, so I'm just about wrapped up. I'm actually, I do my first presentation this evening in Eagle River to our Eagle River Community Councils and surrounding. And that is just looking at what's happened since 2018, what the housing market was before COVID and after COVID. And that's very important to realize, because I don't think a lot of homeowners realize that we basically accelerated and probably went 15 years into the future in like 3 years. To give you an example, as you guys know, I'm a licensed real estate salesperson, so I have access to MLS data, and I own rental properties, so I watch everything on RentLinks, and I did data search. In 2018, at this time, there were 318 rental listings between MLS and RentLinks. RentLinks is this database that monitors. It's kind of like CoStar or Crexi, which is a commercial database for investment property owners. There were 318 rental units available throughout all of Anchorage and Eagle River. Do you know how many there were on July 3rd? How many do you think there are?
Less than 100.
60. Okay? So when we only have 60 available rental units, and you see one-bedroom units in Eagle River going for $1,800 a month, something's got to happen. And this presentation is basically bring it to the forefront of our community councils. Because what I've discovered is that a lot of our community councils are hardworking, fantastic human beings, but they drive back and forth to houses, they don't see it. And they don't understand what's going on because they're not in the rental market, or they're not in the housing market. They haven't been shopping. They've been happily living in their houses for 15, 17 years, and they're like, there's not a problem. And it's like, no, you haven't been shopping yet. It is very common, and at least in my district, Eagle River, for a house to receive 9 to 10 offers in 24 hours. I listed 2 properties. I listed them almost 10% higher than they were valued at last year, and within 24 hours received 5 and 6 offers on each property. Like, this is great for sellers, but we are driving the working force out of our community. And Point2Click, which is a division of watches labor statistics and stuff, it's another tool that real estate professionals use in order to see where the demographics are. According to them, we've lost, in 2 years, 12% of our blue class workers in Anchorage, in Eagle River. 12% of blue collar, mechanics, tradesmen and stuff. I bet you know where they're going, because Wasilla has lowered their property mill rate by 19% in 3 years, because they have so many people moving in there and so many people feeding taxes into their economy. They've been able to lower their tax burden. Well, that comes at a cost to us, doesn't it? That's money that our individuals are driving out of here. So my Title 21 then and now, which is, hey, when we originally drafted Title 21 and they looked at it, here was the data and you can pull it out of the 2020 land use plan, the 2040 land use plan, the Chugach Eagle River Comprehensive Plan, and you can look at all this data and realize there's been a significant shift. Smaller households, less children, different income demographics, different inflationary concerns, different lifestyles, and what are the necessary adjustments that we can make in order to help home ownership? Why is home ownership important? This is part of my presentation. It's the whole reason we have the United States of America, which was private property. Our founding fathers believed that if you didn't own your own property, somebody owns you. You were subject to the wills of the landlord. They may not like your alpaca, your therapy alpaca. They may not like your cat. They may not like what you're saying. They may not like what. And if you're on somebody else's land and you're living there, you're not afforded the same freedoms of someone who owns their land. So the best things we can do for the United States is get more people owning their own property. And I think we've unintentionally created a system where it's very, very, very difficult if you're under the age of 35 to buy and experience that freedom of home ownership that a lot of people in their older generation are blessed to have. So how do we take a look at that and make responsible changes? So my first presentation is this evening to walk through that process and what's changed significantly over the last several years, specifically in light of COVID and the changes, and not only that, but just in financing and how much harder it is to get a residential loan and how much more money it requires you upfront to get. Meanwhile, housing costs go up. That means their savings is dropping. People's savings is dropping at a record low, which leads to get on this hamster wheel. Right? What is a renter? It's a future homeowner trying to save to buy a home. And as we keep burdening those costs and stuff, we just continue to bury them deeper underneath debt and drive that out. So I'll do that one tonight, and then it'll be available to other assembly members if they want to give presentations in their neighborhood, if they want to look at it, with some spots for slides that are specific to your district.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Cross. It sounds like it's going to be an exciting presentation this evening at Eagle River. Member Bronco?
Mr. Cross, I was just looking, the 2018 with the 318 rentals and only 60 now. I just wonder how many people are like me. I'm sitting on a rental, but fairly gun shy after the COVID, no eviction, really picky about who we put in there. And I wonder if there's other people like me and what we could do to protect landlords. I mean, there's been a lot of protections for renters. And we just don't want to get a situation where we have somebody that we can't get out, so.
No, I understand that. So that'd be an Alaska landlord-tenant law question. And the other thing is that's why there's if you need, I can recommend some good attorneys to you that deal with that, because that's not something you want to go through on your own for the first time, believe me. We have the municipality of Anchorage and the state in general has very tenant-friendly laws. And so, I can understand the apprehension. I've always said 90% of your success as a landlord is in tenant quality, right? Because one bad tenant can ruin years of hard work. But those are typically the exception, not the norm. It's important to realize that because of COVID and because we laid a bunch of people off and told them their jobs aren't essential and they didn't earn it, they lost their income, they lost whatever, we created this interesting dynamic where there are probably more great people that are utilizing tax incentive rent programs than ever before. It used to be that only the individuals with the worst credit and stuff would qualify. I've seen medical professionals, I've seen nurses, I've seen getting rental assistance. So you got to understand that's, by the way, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but that's part of the unintended consequences, right? Because if we're not building affordable housing, the government will do it with tax dollars and subsidize it with tax dollars, and then rent gets subsidized by tax dollars. You are paying for it, whether or not you acknowledge it or not. So how do we streamline private development to do that so that the taxpayers don't have to? And meanwhile, help build communities and attract teachers and police officers into our office. But, as far as you're concerned, I understand it, but that's not just the only layer. The other layer is there's a lot of properties that are sitting vacant. That's why we're dealing with the abated or the blighted property. There are tons of real estate out there that just hasn't been improved because, they're scared. A long time ago, you got a code abatement guy on your property, and that was maybe a different generation, but they got their hand bit. They thought they were coming to do a kitchen remodel and discovered they had to do $60,000 to $80,000 worth of property improvements they didn't see coming. And it was like, oh no, I'm not making that phone call again. And so how do we bridge that gap? How do we make sure that those older properties are getting back on the market reasonably, but at the same time, make sure that we're not renting out a life and safety hazard. So it's a complex issue, but I think the biggest thing that we do is I think we're doing a lot of things on the right track. The triplex and fourplex, looking at 4A and what other zoning districts can we consolidate. We regretfully are in a situation where we've got to do in a couple of years what we probably before COVID would have had 10 years to do. But we don't have 10 years. We accelerated so fast in the future and our housing problem got so bleak so quick that we're left making some pretty big changes, and I think that's why we've got this long list of priorities here.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. I just want to remind us, I just want to keep us at a high level to establish that there are workflows in the area and to encourage people to talk offline about the nuances that you may see at this point. Member Burley?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say, Kevin, I really appreciate the focus on rent. I think that's really important, and I think it's one of the biggest disconnects in our community understanding of the housing issue is that the folks who are, well, first of all, housed, second of all, own their property and probably have owned it for 30 to 40 years at this point, like you said, don't have direct connection to the rental market and therefore don't see the problem because your mortgage doesn't go up every year because unless you refinance it, right? I mean, it's just, so you're right, there's that disconnect. And I think the other thing that I would encourage you, and I wish I could go tonight, I can't, but I will go to a future one. I would also really encourage folks to ask people, can you afford your home now? Right, I mean, because there's so many people who bought a starter home 40 years ago, and an increase in value, obviously, but maybe we could afford our place now, but I've heard from a lot of people of all ages who say, I couldn't buy into the neighborhood, or I couldn't buy the house that I have now. And I think that also brings it home for people, because people have this idea that there's the starter home. The starter home does not really exist in Anchorage unless you're talking about a small condo. And I know we could go on about this for hours, but I think, again, I really appreciate it, and I really want to emphasize to all members as you're talking to folks, keep in mind you're probably talking to people who don't have a lot of direct influence or experience in the housing market, but they're the people who show up to our meetings, and so there's this disconnect there.
Well, if I may, real quick, you're right, because 80% of mortgages are under 5%.
Yeah.
That's why they're not selling. Why would I sell my 4.5% interest rate to take on a 7% right now?
Right. Yes, lots in this area. Thank you for the work you're doing. It looks like it's going to be an interesting presentation. I look forward to getting the presentation as well and taking a look at it for East Anchorage. The next three items, I really just want to focus us on just quick updates on where they are and the timeline for them. They all seem to me to be somewhat in motion today. I know there's some things happening on the 4plex expansion, the residential zoning changes, and so I know these things are actually coming up before us, and then the R4 zoning change. So can we just get an update on if there's any lead sponsors or lead members on any of these items, just to bring us up to speed on the status and the timeline? The 3 and 4plex expansion?
That's we have another meeting today, I think at 3 o'clock regarding that one. Is that our next one?
I have to look. I'm not
It
sure.
was on my calendar. I have triplex, fourplex, it's a Teams meeting follow-up at 2 o'clock today. Setting aside this small group to discuss takeaways from the run. So this is just, it looks like Ally and a couple individuals. It's not a full-on meeting, but we have another adjustment meeting here at 2 o'clock today. But I would say that we had a really good one on R2M and some lot sizes and some different adjustments at was that last week or the week before? But I think we're probably about 95% of the way through having an AO regarding the triplex and fourplex, as well as some adjustments to R2M.
Great.
Ready to go. Maybe Dean can speak to that and how far he thinks it is. I mean, I think he has a better perspective than I do.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Cross.
For both of the ordinances, we actually will have two different ordinances, one for Title 21 and one for Title 20. Title 21, we had a really good draft, whose completion, I think just needed some updating from the working group for your changes after the pilot. Title 20 got drafted last year. But for a timeline, August, I think is kind of realistic.
There you go.
Great. Well, that's exciting. That's an exciting area of work that you've all been doing, and August is a nice short window. July is a busy month for the Assembly, so getting this on August is a really good time. Excellent. And the residential zoning changes, is this the one that is out there now that we are looking at? Or is
Not
this
so much, but it
representing a
could be
different-
incorporated, you know, my AO 2023-66, which is still getting amended, and then still, you know, still has to do some work sessions, which is the intention to, you know, how do we consolidate those? How do we go from 15 plus residential zoning districts plus all these to maybe we simplify it down to 6 or 7? You know, we've got some interesting things, you know, when you get into it, even on like R9, which is your 2-acre, you know, large lot residential. It just, you know, I won't go into the details, but some of it just doesn't make sense. And yet, if you make these adjustments, then it ends up looking more like, I don't know, like R7 or something like that, or you have steep slopes, or so it's like, all right, as we amend these, and is there any way that we consolidate these with the intention that when a developer comes in and they want to do something, they don't have to do a rezone, or they don't have to go for a conditional use permit, and they don't have to do all these other extra loopholes and take another 2 to 3 years to do something that was intended density. Because all your different zoning districts have density required. Like the goal is to create this many housing units for this kind of area. If that's our goal, then how do we streamline that process that you can build a duplex on 4 acres, but you can't put 2 single-family houses, 2 small single-family houses on 4 acres? How come there can only be one primary structure? Like, where did this come from? And I can have a 10,000 square foot house in a barn, but I can't have 2 1,000 square foot houses on the same property. Like, if we're looking at density and we need smaller units, how do we consolidate some of our codes? And so I think, you know, I know that's on the book AO 2023-66, but we still got work sessions to do, and I think that's one that's going to be, for the sausage analogy we love, is going to be heavily sausaged.
Well, I'm looking forward to the work session on that. I know that in the public has had lots of comments, lots of energy around and interest in that area. So that's good work to have people focusing on the question at hand, and I'm excited about the work sessions as well coming up. And that seems like it's also good timing with respect to the fall housing summit to have worked through a lot more of their sausage making on that point. Are there any updates to the last item on this particular part, R4A zone change?
I believe, Mr. Chair, Craig Lane, that's the one that was asked to go back to the Fairview Community Council. So that will go there for their August meeting, and then it'll come back to you folks after it gets in.
And what exactly is the R4 change that just capture it really fast?
Okay, so we made some different amendments to R4A to make it easier to do some density requirements. However, it then got pulled back, Boland and Constance sponsored pulling it back to get back before the Fairview Community Council. The biggest thing is the shadow studies. I think that was the biggest headline, is that they didn't want a giant building going next to a small house and then leaving it in the shade. And so that spurs another conversation which we haven't had, and I'd be interested to know is how are those shadow studies done? By what are the metrics? Because my understanding is the shadow studies that we use at Anchorage are based on a model out of the lower 48, and we have completely different solar events.
I'm not certain
Yeah.
where those are
Good
done
question.
from. I know Daniel McKenna Foster in Long Range Planning has been working on that, so I'd have to ask him where they came from. I do know the original impetus, what was occurring with that is that there are only a few places, there are only a few properties that are zoned R4A in this town. It's a relatively new zoning district, and the idea was this might be an opportunity to create more development. And so there are only a few places where they exist, but in the comp plan, or the land use plan map, I should say, it shows several potential areas that they could go in, and one of those areas was in Fairview. And so that's why Mr. Constant asked to hear Fairview Community Council's view on that.
And that expectation of that presentation is
Was
when?
at their August meeting.
At their August meeting.
Yeah, but I'm not 100% certain of the date of that, so I don't know if it would be back in time in front of you folks in August or September. I don't know exactly sure.
Yeah.
Dates.
Well, that's good, and that's good news that there is work on that. That the chair is on it kind of focused on that and looking at it through the lens of his community with respect to the other potentials across the municipality. Member Brawl?
Yeah, I guess I would, this is probably beyond the R4A thing, but this community has talked about solar access and solar rights basically as a concept for many years. And I think it would be helpful if we maybe had that would be a separate project, but to have a general conversation, do we codify that or not? Because basically it's used to block development, to block code changes. And I think to your point, Kevin, about as I understand it, if you picture a clock face, the sun in the course of a day in the year moves most of the way around the clock face, right? Like most of the hours. And so it's really difficult to codify something that changes that much in this climate. And I've heard that from multiple planners over the years. And I don't necessarily mean city, I just mean folks who work in the planning world. And so I think, I don't know that it's feasible. I think it's basically, as I said, used as a barrier to making change. And so I would just want to have that conversation. So maybe we start a project, maybe it comes to this committee, I don't know, but I think we need to have that because otherwise we talk about it in these piecemeal other ways, but that's really what we're getting at.
Yes.
Do people have solar access rights or not?
Thank you, Member Brawl. Member Cross?
No, I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to take into consideration that we're limiting construction when we have almost minimal sunlight during the winter, and then maximum sunlight during the summer. And so if we're going to have a solar access rights or we're going to have a shadow study, is it based on what happens here, or is it being based on what happened in Phoenix, Arizona?
That is a very, very valid point to be able to explore and understand, and then just considering the way it works across the year, how do you measure it at any one point in the year?
When is it feasible? That's
Yeah.
the thing.
No, it's really great, and Member Brawley, I think your point about a different project is really exactly correct. And I think that's an exciting area for us to begin to explore, and I think this committee is the right place for those conversations to happen. So, thank you, everybody. We worked through a pretty dense list of priorities. Mr. Gates.
Well, I know two of the projects that sort of fit on this list.
Yes.
I'm not really sure, I guess, what they are with you. I guess this is under the other category, and I just wanted to speak up before we moved on it.
No, that's fine.
But one was to make a change to rezoning. So there's a limitation on rezoning areas that need to be large, for zoning districts. Rezoning is 1.75 acres, that's okay. But there's a proposal maybe coming to either the Planning and Zoning Commission or you guys July 25th to make it easier for a property owner who needs to zone to just do it in more sort of even if the property is smaller than 1.75 acres, which is the limitation. And so there's a few exceptions to that, and there's another exception for a property owner who wants to build to just do the rezone faster, not requiring them to do a huge area of zone. So it's called the zoning process.
Okay.
So another one that I guess is in the pipe right now and works is the residential design standards chapter in Top 21 to revise it. I haven't dug into that extensively, but generally it's to I guess residential design standards make the whole review and application process really lengthy. So the goal is to really simplify the requirement that's been brought up from times as here and in some groups not. That's when there's obstacles to be efficient and enhance the development process the residential design standards. So,
Great. So we'll expect those bodies of work to come over the next couple of months as well. Thank you, Gates, for that update. We worked through all of these items. If there's any additional comments or information that folks think about after the fact, feel free to send us an email. Send it to the chairs, and we'll make sure, and to our staff, and we'll make sure we capture those as well. I will try to work with our staff and also have kind of a report back from today for our next meeting, so we can all have kind of a sense of the timelines that we've established today for these particular areas, and we'll work with Member Cross on working out our calendar so that we can look across the next year essentially and try to put them on the calendar as best as we can outward so that we have an expectation of who to invite and how to do this work across the year. The next item, I want to just have a quick introduction. Item B for new business is vacant and abandoned properties, and I called it housing activation. And I really just wanted to high level today describe this area of interest that I have for this committee to do this work and bringing it to a forward front burner position. And we heard earlier some work around distressed properties, blighted properties. I see a lot of those nexus things working in our favor, but essentially at a high level, when a good public policy can meet multiple goals, I like to pursue it. And so distressed properties are problematic in the community for myriad reasons. And I know, because we get as members, we have both the constituents and the communities calls for the nuisance properties, the drug dens, the crime and mischief that often festers around some of these properties, meets also the way that the blighted and dilapidated properties affect housing prices and property values in communities and the overall quality of life. So you have lots of issues with respect to just what can cities do better and what other tools are available. I think that's a strong area for us to want to explore and that there's work in that front from Senator Dunbar, coming from this body, bringing that to the state. I think that's exciting for us to be into. But I'm really focused on the other question that Mr. Cross mentioned earlier as well, which is there are a lot of units, potential units, that are made up by these blighted properties, vacant and abandoned properties. And just at a high level, there's a map that I hope that we'll bring as a resource, but there are literally hundreds of available residential units for residents. So there are lots of properties that are on our vacant and abandoned list. There are other properties that are not on our list that are probably close to, if not past, the point of distressed. So effective cities, one of the tools that cities are utilizing are looking at these through a redevelopment and economic development lens. How to turn blighted properties back on into housing units that are required in our community for the different strata of housing needs, for example. And the first two that I will just flag for us, again, high level, this is about the intentionality, and then I hope people start to think about these things, and I will lay out a timeline for us before we go into public comments, or audience participation rather. But 2 case studies that trigger this concept in terms of aggressively pursuing housing activation with these properties. First, there are 2 blighted properties in Mountain View, 4-plex, basically side by side. Some folks who work in the permitting space might know of these properties. They are boarded up today. They were bank owned, or the bank was sitting on them as blighted properties. A person who has a nonprofit who's working through permanent supportive housing programming has created a strategy to renovate these buildings, working with the municipality on fees and other things that we may have control over to work with this person. But their intentionality is within 5 to 6 months having 30 units enough for 30 residents for permanent supportive housing, turning on from 2 blighted properties that are negatively impacting Mountain View today. That's exciting stuff to me. It's exciting to see that we can have people who are willing to step up into that space and turn on housing units for a need in the community. There are other ways we can think about that, whether it's different strata of needs, also different ways to approach how we excite people to get involved in redeveloping or developing these properties. So there are lots of things we could do from that front. And I also had a conversation with someone that I hope to bring here for a direct presentation on this, Jason Bockenstadt from the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust. And they're working on, we all know, people will just correct me, it's the Barrett and the Lake Shore. Those are workforce housing, 80 to 100% poverty level. So these are extremely low income housing opportunities and workforce housing opportunities. Well, they're also interested in this conversation for a different classification of housing, not permanent supportive housing, but workforce housing. So I'm interested in us having this conversation both from a perspective of what are we actually looking at that's out there on our current list, what are the statuses of these properties, and the ability to help create the conditions to move them toward activating housing. But then also I'm interested in what are we as a city doing with respect to our investments, as I was around long enough to remember the calls to action around the alcohol sales tax. And one of the areas of direct, hard investments that we wanted to highlight was housing investments, affordable housing, and alleviating the pressure on shelter by the Housing First call to action, essentially. So I'm interested in both how we are funding our investments in the housing area of the continuum of care and what we can do to deepen those investment strategies, meets how this particular area of opportunity may meet a real innovative moment for Anchorage to activate some properties that Anchorage may need, or that we definitely do need. So there are other thoughts. I want us to get into a work session. My intention is to have a presentation at our next session from the folks who have the municipal list, so we can all get a real snapshot. We will share the data of the list and the maps prior to that meeting, but I would like to bring in all of these folks a little across the way as we go over the next couple of months, so that by the housing summit, we have a really clear picture of how we could turn on these units, how many units we could turn on, what are the activation costs, and how are we creating an innovative opportunity for development, redevelopment, and incentivization around that for next year. So by the housing summit, I would love for us to be in a position with this conversation robustly. I'll go to Mr. Cross and then Member Brawley.
Yeah, you know, I've been rehabbing properties for about 25 years, and one of the issues we ran into in less than the last 10 years or so actually falls around law enforcement. We just heard from municipal attorneys that each of our prosecutor attorneys are handling over 300 cases apiece.
Yeah.
And they're behind.
Yeah.
So what we saw happen in Mountain View, and I think I know specifically the properties you're talking to, however, there's more than one pair of fourplexes
Yes.
or fiveplexes that are blighted north of Tudor, is that individuals were breaking into these properties, the police would show up, and unless they had a warrant, they weren't being arrested. And I could stand there in front of my property and watch the police escort these people off, and they're like, my hands are tied. These people are just trespassing. If they say that they were invited, and you didn't catch them in the act of breaking in, and they said that they were just invited, but the guy who invited them isn't there, it was trespassing, and wasn't breaking in. And so because you didn't have evidence of them on camera breaking into your property, although they run an extension cord from the neighbor's property, they're living in it, they weren't getting arrested, they were just being escorted. And as the cops drove away, you could stand there in the driveway and watch those people who were just in your property going to the bathroom in bathtubs or doing whatever it is, and needles and stuff in your property. You could watch them go down and checking the doors of boiler rooms of other properties as they walk down the street and looking for other places to go. And it was the same people every time. And then what happens is after you have a call out or 2 or 3 times, then code abatement gets notified, and now you as the property owner are getting fined because you have a nuisance property when you've gone, I've called the cops on these people multiple times and you're just not getting arrested. And now you're getting fined because you can't put 24-hour security on there because you're not enforcing the laws that are on the books because our prosecutors are behind and the police officers are short on staff. And then these property owners end up feeling like a victim. And like those fourplexes, that's what happened to those investors. Some investors bought it, COVID shut them down, they couldn't find roofers, they couldn't find contractors, it took longer to do the work. Meanwhile, they're getting fined thousands of dollars for a nuisance property because the people breaking into it aren't getting arrested. We drove them out. So I think it's not just how do you streamline that construction process, but how do we make sure that you don't become a victim of a criminal enterprise that steals tools and just camps out on properties? Because at that point, then if private development won't do it, the only answer is tax subsidized nonprofits coming in and doing this.
It's a complex area. I'd like, we're at time. I'd like, there's one more member that raised their hand for a comment, and so Member Brawl.
Yeah, just real briefly, on the point of enforcement, I would really like that conversation to include code enforcement, because what I've seen over the years is, and I understand we're complaint-driven enforcement, the flip side of the property owner who's the victim is the property owner who does not invest in their property and then puts that problem on everybody else.
That's right.
So I think we also need to talk about it, how we make sure that we're enforcing, and I know there's a real reluctance in Alaska and in this city to put that pressure on property owners, but we need to be willing to do it. So I just want
Yes,
to, that needs to be talked about with this.
Absolutely, and this is why I just wanted to flag that the conversation is a big conversation just with that title of vacant and abandoned properties and the way we can turn those back on and all of the complexities around that. So expect that to be a front burner item for our committee, and I hope that we're able to ignite that area of growth. At this point, are there any members of audience participation? Most people here are on the clock. So, we will adjourn this meeting at 10:31. Thank you, everybody.